Well, good morning. It's good to be with you again today. Evan is taking his family on a vacation, and looks like they were in Cape Canaveral based on a couple of pictures that I saw, so hope they have a blessed week. This is going to be a different, I hate to call it a sermon because it's really more of a, like, understanding where we are, but within the context of the biblical theme of generations. And when you think about the Old Testament is really just the story, a narrative of generations. It starts with Adam, and it carries through the entire Old Testament, leading up to Jesus the Messiah. In fact, if you even, just to outline the book of Genesis, if you wanted to do it easily, you can just look at the three areas where it begins a new section with, and these are the generations of Adam. These are the generations of Noah. These are the generations of Abraham. And really, the Old Testament is just a carry on of that. So when you get into the books of the Kings, and they're going and begat, and begat, and begat, it's like they're tracing these generations. And so I want to look at that from a more modern perspective that impacts us today. But to kind of get the feeling for what this looks like from a biblical perspective, I've got two passages of Scripture here. The first one is from Joshua. And this is when Joshua is at the conclusion of his life, and he's putting together, and I put Joshua, it's really Judges 2. I don't know why I put Joshua there. So it's Judges 2, 6 through 10. And it says, when Joshua dismissed the people of Israel went each to his inheritance to take possession of the land. And the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. And Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. And they buried him within the boundaries of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres in the hill country of Ephraim, north of the mountain of Gash. All the generations also were gathered to their father. And there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. And then the next passage is from Ezra. So this is after the people are brought back into the land following their exile in Babylon. And they are at the point where they've been given permission to rebuild the temple. And so this from Ezra chapter 3 says, and all the people shouted with great joy when they praised the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But many of the priests and Levites and heads of the fathers' houses, old men who had seen the first house, wept with a loud voice when they saw the foundation of this house being laid, though many shouted aloud for joy, so that the people could not distinguish the sound of the joyful shout from the sound of the people's weeping. For the people shouted with great shout, and the sound was heard far away. So this is where the title for this sermon comes from. The old people weep while the young people rejoice. And the old people, in this case, are remembering back to the glory of the temple. They were old enough to have seen it in all. This would have been Solomon's temple, and they could remember the glory of that temple. And the temple that was being built following the exile was much smaller. And it was something that, just honestly, if you remembered what the previous temple looked like, it was like, this was disappointing. And so the old people are weeping, but this is the first time that this generation has actually been able to see a temple. And so they're seeing the restoration of their country, they're seeing the restoration of their temple, and they're rejoicing. So you see this contrast. And that's kind of what we want to look at today as we consider the generations and how they're impacting us. And there's a handout that I placed, and if you didn't get one, maybe someone can grab one for you, but it's also pretty small. And if you'd like a larger copy of it, send me an email, and I'll mail you a larger one for your record so you can have it. And my email is ellerchristopher@gmail.com. And just say you'd like this bigger copy, and I can send that to you. So What we're going to do today is look at the generational cycles and how they are impacting us today. And there's really two aspects I want to look at with that. The first one is identifying where we are in the current generational cycle. And then the second one is how that's going to impact the future of the church. And when I talk about the church today, I'm talking about the American church. So not this specific local church, and not necessarily the church in China or the church in Europe or the church in Africa, but the American church. How the generational cycles that we're experiencing right now are going to impact us in the future. And my thinking on this has really been influenced by 3 books. And this is something I've studied, honestly, for a long time. So I'm a history guy by nature, and history's always been fascinating. And history is really the story of cycles. And the most influential book is one called The Fourth Turning. And this was published back in the 1990s. And they identify the cycles of American history. So when you look at those cycles, you see that each new era begins with a significant person. So the first one they identify is George Washington. And then you go ahead 80 years and you see Abraham Lincoln. And then you go ahead 80 years and you see Franklin Roosevelt. And then you go 80 years and that's where we are today. So this helps us understand these cycles. The second book, which was published in early 2020 and was written in the 2017-18 period, is called The Storm Before the Calm. And here's the interesting. If you read The Fourth Turning back in the 1990s, they identified the years 2015 to 2030 as the fourth turning, the time of crisis. And if you read The Storm Before the Calm, written in 2017-18, he identifies the 2020s as the storm before the calm. So you can see how these cycles are kind of lining up. And I'm going to explain to you in a second why that is, why everyone looks at this period of time as the time of crisis and transition. And then the last book is really related to the church in general. And this one was published in it was last year, 2024. And he looks at it from his specifically Christian perspective, how this generation has seen 3 different eras of Christian influence within America. So, what is a generation? Well, according to Psalms 90:10, a generation is the days of our lives are 70 years, and if by reason of strength they are 80, yet boast is only the labor and sorrows, for it is soon cut off and we fly away. So a generation is 80 years. And you can always give or take, but if you look at American demographics right now, the average lifespan of an American is 78.4 years. So it's 80 years. And how that begins to play out then is when you look at the current generations. So we just had the funeral of Jimmy Carter a couple of weeks ago. Jimmy Carter is probably one of the last of his generation, born in 1924. So he lived to be 100 years old. And the generations that have influenced our country during our lifetime are the greatest generation, which is the World War II generation. They were born between 1901 and 1927. The silent generation was born between 1928 and 1945. These would be my parents. Probably a lot of you would look at your parents maybe being born in that generation. The thing to notice here is that there seems to be an alternating trend. So the greatest generation had huge significance. The silent generation was just that. It was silent. Not only do they have greater influence, but their population size is much greater. So the greatest generation was much bigger than the silent generation. Then we get to the baby boomers, which is probably a lot of you in this room, born between 1946 and 1964. Largest generation in American history. Then you've got Generation X. This would be me. And we are the silent. We've lived our life in the shadow of the boomers. Plus, we're a much smaller generation than the boomers were. Then you get the next major generation, which is the millennials. These are people born between 81 and 96. Then you've got the Gen Z, which is going to be a much smaller. So you see how it's kind of major influential generation. And these names are newer to American understanding. So the boomers were kind of the first one to be identified. And honestly, it was just because there were so many of them, born between 1946 and 1964. 1964 is a really important year to keep in mind, because if you lived through this period of time, you saw a shift in America between the 1950s and early 1960s, and then the latter part of the 60s onward. What happened in 1964 that would change everything? The first baby boomer graduated from high school. This was the year that they entered out of their growing up years and started entering into their adult life. So you had the first baby boomers going to college. You had riots. You had campus unrest. You had the Vietnam War. You had the drug culture. You had the sexual revolution. All of these things happened post-1964 when the boomers were coming into their influence. If you look at the next slide, I like to think about generations in terms of seasons. So the boomer generation, the springtime in their life was 1946 to 1964. This is when they were growing up. They grew up in 1950s America. Leave it to Beaver. Their young adult life is represented by summer. So 1965 to 1994. This is when they are going through college. They are entering into their work fields. 1994 is when they enter their season of influence. So you think about Bill Clinton was the first baby boomer president elected in 1992. George H.W. Bush was the last Great Generation president elected. So there was a shift there. So you now have, for the next 30 years, you're going to have boomers in positions of authority and power. And then you enter into 2015 to 2030, and that's where we are today. We're in the winter of life for boomers. Their influence is starting to dwindle, and they're still in positions of authority, but we're seeing less and less. They're rapidly dying off every day as more and more boomers hit that 80 mark. So as we look at the church during this generation, there's really three things that boomers influenced. They grew up, as I said, in the golden era. So this would be small churches. This church, I'm not sure exactly when this was planted, but I would guess this is a golden era church, planted in the 1950s, 62? Yep, so right in there. You get into that next era, and this is when the boomers really had an influence on the church. This is when the megachurch movement really began to take off. Two key boomers were Bill Hybels and Rick Warren. Without question, they influenced churches more than anybody. And the fundamental change that you saw in a boomer church was the definition of success. It became numbers, it became money, and it became influence. Those were the things that the church was defined as successful. So pastors who could grow a church of 10,000 people were viewed as celebrities. I mean, they had a lot of influence. Rick Warren specifically developed a model that became the purpose-driven church, and it influenced churches all across the world. Every church in the mid-90s was trying to be a purpose-driven church. And that model is something that really took hold. And then you enter into the period of 2015 to 2030, and you're really seeing the reorganization. So a lot of those big churches that were founded by the Rick Warrens and the Bill Hybels, they're diminishing. They're losing their influence because these key pastors, these celebrity pastors, are retiring, are dying. And so I put the picture there of Willow Creek. Willow Creek is probably the most influential church of the last part of the 20th century, and today they're struggling for existence because it's such a huge operation. It takes millions and millions of dollars to operate something like that. And the celebrity pastor, Bill Hybels, has been disgraced and is no longer on the scene. So they're really struggling. And you're seeing this happen to boomer churches all over the place. So this is kind of the context with which we're finding ourselves today. So look at the millennial generation if we compare it to the boomers and using the seasons of life. So 1980 to 2000 were their teenage years. 2001 to 2030 are their young adult years. And 2031 to 2060 will be their years of influence. We see that in politics right today. You've got Donald Trump, who's a boomer, and sitting right behind him is likely the first millennial president, J.D. Vance. Both are very capable, but you're seeing that transition of power. It's going to be interesting to see how this next election plays out as the boomers are getting older and older, but they're still clinging on to power. Chuck Grassley, our senator, 93 years old. I think he's the oldest member of Congress right now, which is crazy to believe, but it is. So now we get to the church. And this is where we focus in on how American culture has shifted over time. And the book I'm relying on here is Life in the Negative World by Aaron Renn. And he has put a framework in place of 3 different eras within the boomer generation. He's got positive world, negative world, or neutral world, and negative world. And these 3 each have distinct purposes or traits. And so as you look at your experience, you'll probably recognize these. Positive world existed between basically the 1950s and up to 1994. This was the high water mark for American Christianity. This is when "In God We Trust" was inserted into our motto and placed on our coins. This is when "One Nation Under God" was inserted into our Pledge of Allegiance. This is when the Bible and prayer were still active within public schools in that golden era period of time. But you saw it diminishing over this period of time. The point here is that Christianity was viewed positively in America. So being a member of a church was something that was a positive attribute. Dwight Eisenhower, who had never been a member of a church, when he ran for president in 1952, he was baptized into the Episcopal Church before he ran because he needed to be a member of a church. This was an era when this was the biblical ethics of Western civilization, Judeo-Christian ethics, were still very strong in America. And if you look at the next one, neutral world, this is where we've been for the past 30 years, roughly. So you've got 1994 to 2014. In this period of time, society really took a neutral stance towards Christianity. Christians were no longer viewed with privilege, nor were they disfavored. It was kind of like, you do you, I'll do me. It was just kind of indifferent. Christianity is one of many valid options within a growing, pluralistic, multicultural society. And that's really the piece to focus on there. America has become multicultural, and here's how you see that being played out. If you went back into the 1950s and you were to ask an academic, how do you get to heaven? This could be a Christian or non-Christian. They would say, well, there's a God of the Bible. Jesus is his son. That's how you get to heaven. If you ask that question during this period of time, the answer would be all roads lead to heaven. Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, they're all talking about the same God. And they all lead to the same place. This is multiculturalism and pluralism. This has really become how Americans view Christianity or view religion. And then you transition to the negative world, and this is where we are today. And society has an overall negative view of Christianity. Why does he pick 2014? Well, 2014 was really the year, and I don't know what kicked it off, but this was the year that wokeism really began to come into play. And so a lot of countries companies started putting their DEI policies into place. You've heard a lot about this in the last couple of weeks because Donald Trump has ended DEI. But DEI was viewed as the antithesis of Christianity. So if you were a Christian, you were viewed as closed-minded, bigoted, and racist. Those were things that they attributed to Christianity. So going into a large corporation like Principal Financial Group or applying for a job in the government, if you put down that you were a Christian, that was not viewed as a favorable thing. It had a negative connotation to it now. And that's a change from how we lived much of our life where it really didn't matter. This era that we are living in right now is how we're transitioning. And so it brings us to the 2020s. And these are the things that we have to wrestle with now as this generation who's living through this change. Christians are now a moral minority in society that is openly secular. Baby boomers are losing power, money, and control because they're dying. The redefinition of the establishment is taking place. Establishment is now a negative word. If you're part of the establishment, that's viewed negatively. There's a rural and urban divide in America. If you look at the last electoral map, you saw large population areas, Chicago, Atlanta, Los Angeles, New York, which were hard blue country. And yet you get to the rest of the country, rural America mostly, it's red. So there's this divide, and it's not over class, it's not over race, it's over urban and rural areas mostly. And there's growing differences over interpretation of Christian morals and ethics. Here's how I think this is going to play out. For those of us that have been part of the church over many years, we understand that homosexuality in the Bible is viewed negatively, that it's a sin, and that same-sex marriage is something that the church cannot support. But I think as we move into the next decades, that's going to change. I think within the next 20 to 30 years, this will be something that the younger generation is going to be like, meh, I don't know that it's that big a deal. And you're already seeing conservative churches wrestle with this topic. They're trying to smooth it out. They're trying to be less dogmatic about it. And I think that's something that, as a church, it's just another sign of how we are letting the world influence us. I've read and listened to big church pastors in large urban areas who are having to minister to a lot of people who would be hostile if you were to say you came out against same-sex marriage. And they're trying to be very careful how they're doing that. You know, J.D. Greer, who's been president of the Southern Baptist Convention, he said that the Bible whispers about homosexuality, but it shouts about these other things. He's nuancing it. He's trying to be very careful with how he words that. And the thing that I would challenge people with is that they are doing this, they say, in the name of evangelism, like we need to reach our city. But the truth is they're just trying to bring the people in. They're not preaching or changing lives. They're not saying, thus saith the Lord, here's what the Bible teaches. They're trying to nuance this so that it becomes acceptable. And I think this is an area where you're going to see Christian values and morals begin to be shaded over the next several years as we go through this transition. So these are the things that we as a church are dealing with as we head into this. If you look at the attendance in America, you'll see that in 2000, 35% of the people said they attended church weekly, and 15%, less than 12, it was 12%, said that they attend monthly. You can see that bottom line there that's kind of flat. And then you can see those who say they never attend. That's skyrocketed. So essentially, in the last 25 years, you've seen a flip between those who said they attend church weekly and those who say they never attend. This is what a secular America looks like. Church is becoming less important to the population as a whole. And how we shape our ministry over the next 20 years is going to be reflected in these realities that we're dealing with. It's not the age where you can just put a church in a community and then people start coming to it. It's like the good thing is the people who come to church now are likely true believers. They're not here because they need a checkbox next to their name when they apply, when they run for city council. The people that are coming to church are here because they want to be, because they love the Lord, and because they want to grow and be a faithful disciple of His. But that means that the population as a whole, they're not interested in checking that box. So how does this look? And this now we get into, we're not talking history, but we're talking projection. Okay? So now we're having to look at all the evidence that we've learned over the last 80 years, and we realize that we are at the tail end of the boomer generation. And that from this point on, the millennial generation will be the one of influence. And so when we look at how the church is going to be shaped, we're looking at their values, their morals, their ethics, what they hold to be dear. And it's different than their boomer parents and grandparents. So this comes from a book called Future Church, which is by Will Mancini. Here's some of the things that he has seen. The shift from attendance-centered to disciple-making churches. So having a church that can seat 3,000 people is really part of the past. You see churches all over that have large auditoriums that can seat 2,000 or 3,000 people, and they're looking for ways to shrink that down because they don't have 2,000 or 3,000 people coming to their church anymore. So less significance upon the attendance and more upon disciple making. Focus on mission, not models. In other words, what's our mission here at Cornerstone versus we're going to be a purpose-driven church. And we're going to go to a conference and we're going to get a book and they're going to tell us how to do church. Instead, we're looking at our community and we're being like, how can we reach our community? What are the things we need to do, rather than looking at what Saddleback is doing in Southern California and being like, that's what we need to do. It's a shift. Crisis of cultural relevance in a post-Christian society. What does this look like? One of the most influential Christian organizations in Iowa is the Family Leader. In 2024, they endorsed Ron DeSantis. Their endorsement has meant everything over the years. Donald Trump went away with that. It wasn't even close. Their endorsement didn't mean a thing. In the 2024 election, there were a lot of things, pro-life issues that would have been near and dear to evangelicals, and the Republican Party said, yeah, we're not going to run on that this time. We still hold to it, but it's not going to be a plank in our platform. It didn't matter. They won without evangelical support. A lot of evangelical leaders came out against Donald Trump and even endorsed Kamala Harris, and he won in spite of it. So the era of the moral majority and the evangelical influence being a strong force is waning. Does it mean it's over? No, but it's waning. And so we need to recognize that. A redefinition of measuring success away from attendance, giving, and programming. This one is how, for a church that is smaller, you guys have always lived here. But for a church that is a large church, this is what matters. I've been a part of this all my adult life. Attendance, giving, and programs. This is the foundation. And these things were like, this is how you measured success, if you were doing well in these areas. And that's millennials don't care about this as much as boomers did. Boomers were very driven by these things, and millennials are more like, I want to see if we're making a difference in the lives of people. I want to be mission-driven. You hear missional a lot more. The need for simpler, smaller churches. Why? Because in this new era that we're heading into, Having a church that's running on a multi-million-dollar budget is going to be difficult. The boomers are the wealthiest generation that has ever lived in America. And at the same time, they've been the most generous. The millennials don't have the money at this point that the boomers have had, and they don't have the giving ethic that their parents and grandparents did. And so organizations that have lived off of the generosity of boomers are going to find it more difficult in the era when their churches are filled with millennials who are laden down with student loan debt, who are living beyond their means, and who are trying to figure out how they're going to pay each week's bills compared to their parents who lived in the same house for 50 years. And it was a small little house that they raised their family in, and they didn't really get into all of that stuff. This is going to change how the church looks. The decentralization of church leadership. Again, I think this points to the decline of celebrity pastors. It's going to be much more important who is standing here rather than who's standing in Atlanta or Nashville or Dallas. Local ministry is really what's going to matter. The necessity for clarity and vision. Why are we here? Why has God put this church here? What are the things that we specifically can be called to do in the community in which we've been placed? Understanding that the church is a movement, not an institution. It's not about the institution of the church. The church, when Jesus said that the gates of hell will not prevail against the church, he was talking about the movement of the church. He wasn't talking about the institution. Because you know what? One of the best tours you can take today is to go visit the wonderful churches of the first century. And they're all in ruins. Ephesus, Thyatira, Colossus, all of Thessalonica, all of these places that were the size, the significant churches of the New Testament, they're all in ruins. So it's not about the institution, it's about the movement. And that's what, when Jesus said that the church will never be overcome, it's about the movement that we're talking about, the movement of Christianity. So finally, strategies for the negative world. And now we're back to Aaron Wren. Living as a moral minority means political alignments are shifting. We've talked about that. Unknown territory, so taking the mindset of an explorer. The boomers have laid a path, but from this point forward, the millennials are going to have to figure it out. And they're going to have a explorer mindset. Having the heart of Joshua, who said, let's conquer new territory, versus Hezekiah, who, when confronted with the problem, basically said, as long as I can live the rest of my life, I'm good. That's the next generation's problem. So being a Joshua and being mission-driven versus, I'm going to let the next generation worry about that. Focus on local influence and not national influence. Areas of focus that are important: education, equipping, morals, and ethics. I put in there the parenthesis of vice. What is vice? Vice are the things that are destroying our country today. Gambling. Do you know how many, just watch any sports league on television and you're going to see FanDuel. You're going to see all of these different gambling mechanisms. You do it right from your phone. And there's people who are being pulled into this. You're seeing the vice of pornography, which is just like, it's everywhere. You don't have to go digging for it. It's just everywhere you turn. You're seeing the vice of recreational drugs. We're talking about how we can legalize marijuana. Marijuana is no different than alcohol, they argue, right? So we should legalize it. These are all vices and they're things that we're just like, we don't really care about anymore. And so we have to be, as Christians, our ethics and morals have to be able to weigh into this. Prioritize individual faithfulness over institutional conservation. This is speaking to us as individuals. We have to be faithful. It's not about the church being faithful. It's about the people inside who are faithful. What does it matter if the church is viewed as this rock-solid institution of faith, and yet all of the people that go to that church are immoral, unethical, thieves? The thing that's important is that we as individuals be seen as ethical, morally strong, biblically sound disciples. And then the church lives off of that, not the other way around. Cultivate alternative economies, businesses, and institutions. You're seeing that. Christian schools are a great illustration of this. If you don't like public schools, put your kids in Christian school. It costs money, but I can tell you, as someone who put 3 kids through Christian school from 3 years old on, God does it. I don't know how. I never knew how we could afford. At one point, our Christian school tuition was higher than our house payment. We were paying so much, but God just provided. That's a conviction we had. So look for alternatives. You have to favor Christian businesses if there's a choice. These are areas where we can make a difference. I know Target's convenient. I shop at Target. We don't have a lot of options there, but if there's options, look for them and support them. Engage missionally to create healthy communities, and that just means being an influence in your community and living your life as a Christian and not being afraid to have those conversations. So, man, this has been a fire hose, I know. That's why I gave you the notes. If I can just summarize this in a couple of things, we are in the midst of a generational transition. Okay? The 2020s are when the boomers, who have been the most influential generation of our lifetimes, are in decline, and the millennials are on the rise. And it's going to be different. It's going to look different. It's going to feel different. It's going to be as different as 1950 was from 1970. There's a huge difference there. The millennials are going to be the people who are coming into authority and influence, and those of us that are in that older generation, we're going to be, even if we're retired, we're going to have less influence than we had when we were at the peak of our life. So we need to plan on this. We need to be thinking and talking about these things. How does this influence us? But understanding the context of where we are is really important, because this is not 2000. This is not 1990. This is not 2010. The 2020s are when it's happening. And this is the decade when all of these transitions will be taking place. And the church as we know it and the country will look very different in 2035 as it does from today. And so how do we navigate that? This is kind of a crazy sermon, isn't it? But I hope it helps you understand some of the context with which we are living in right now. I'd originally asked for... When I came in, Lloyd was like, "Can I do anything for you?" And I'm like, 3 hours. I need 3 hours. And he said, "Boy, I don't know. That's a tough one." So we got it done, and I'm available for any questions that you guys have. This is something that I've studied for a long time, as you can probably tell, and I find it very interesting to be alive at this period of time. It's very interesting. This is the 1930s. Okay, if you want a comparison, we're living through the 1930s. Only it's the 2020s. Very interesting time. But it's also a time when we will see God work in many, many ways, but they're going to be different. As a new generation of explorers rise up and begin to exert their influence over the country and the city that we live in. So, let me close this in prayer. Father, I thank you so much for those who have gone before us and have paved the way. And Lord, I pray as we look to the future that we would trust in you, not trust in the ways that we have grown comfortable with, but as you lead us into this next era in our country and in our community, that you would give us confidence in you and in your leadership. And so, Holy Spirit, I just pray that you would just indwell each one of us and that you would give us clear discernment and understanding, and that we would be voices that would speak in biblical, have a biblical influence of those that we are around. Lord, even as we think about our new government, President Trump and those that he's appointing, Lord, I pray that you would place people of godly influence in his circle who can speak biblical truth. Lord, we thank you for just the many blessings you have showered upon us, and we thank you for the freedom and the safety that we enjoy today. And may we not be unwise in how we steward that, but be wise stewards moving forward. For I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.